And I'll let you know, Tracy, once we're good. I think should be coming up here in a second.
All right.
And we're good.
All right. Hi, thanks for joining us. Welcome to the Houston React Developers Group. My name is Tracy. I'm one of the co-organizers along with Fabian, who is also logged into tonight's meetup. And FYI, tonight will be our last meetup for 2022. Don't worry, we will be back for 2023. Until then, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, go through our video library and watch some of those previous meetups and share them with others. So for tonight's topic, the title is From Mixins to Custom Hooks, History of Sharing in React. Our presenter is Ben. Ben is a front-end architect for Stitch Fix. I will let Ben introduce himself and talk a little bit more during his presentation once he takes control of the screen. Before we get started, as always, during the presentation, please feel free to enter in any of your questions in the chat, and we will make sure that Ben gets to those at the end of the presentation. And lastly, as always, before we get started, if anyone has a topic that they would like to see a presentation on, or if you are interested in presenting yourself, please fill out the link that we have in the description of the live video and fill that out, and we will get back to you on presenting. With that, I'm going to have Fabian go ahead and mute everyone but Ben and turn off our screens and let Ben take it away for his presentation.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. So as you said, my name is Ben Ilegbodu. I am awesome to be a part of this. I wish I actually was in Houston, but maybe one day. So I'm going to be sharing about sharing in React. Okay, so we're going to basically go on a 8-year journey with React. But what I'm going to do, instead of going past to present, I'm going to work our way backwards. So we're going to start with hooks, beginning there, and then going to Mixins from 8 years ago. So I want to let you know that my slides, these slides right here, they're online. So you can follow that link, benmvp.com/HRD-hooks, and you can find the links there, or you can go to my website, benmvp.com, and you will find it on the speaking page. So I'm going to try to pay attention to the chat as we go. So feel free to join in, make comments, whatever the case may be, ask questions. And of course, you can ask questions for the end. Okay, so let's continue. React, its approach to building user interfaces makes sharing and reuse great. And I have an example right here. So React is especially great at sharing user interfaces, sharing components. So in this code right here, we have a slideshow component. No doubt it has lots of markup, CSS, styling, UI logic for paginating, and all those sorts of things. So you can see 5 at a time and go to page 2, page 3, page 4, etc. And we can easily use it in 2 different components, right? So on the left, we have the players component that shows a list, a slideshow of team player photos, let's say. And then on the right, we have a teams component, which is going to show a slideshow of, let's say, team logos. All right, and then you can paginate between the different pages and each one of them in the slideshow. And because React is just JavaScript, right? You can share helpers too. So here we have the fetch images helper, right? So well, one, you can share helper functions, you can share API utilities, data transformations like Lodash. You can do all sorts of things like that directly from component code. And here we have our fetch images component.
Hey, Ben, I think we might have lost the screen.
Oh, did I
or
unshare
your
my screen? Hold on, let me share again. Hold on. I thought I just saw myself. How about that?
Perfect.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Click the wrong button. Sorry again. Okay, let's start over. So like I said, React is just JavaScript. So in this code here, we have a fetch images component, or fetch images helper rather. So it takes a page that you want to retrieve and an optional team ID here. And what the details doesn't really matter so much, but it's going to be able to retrieve a bunch of images given this information. So you give it a team ID, then it'll return a list of players for that team. But if team ID is undefined, then it'll return a list of team logos. So I want you to keep this fetch images utility in mind because we'll be referencing it throughout the rest of our time together. Okay, so keep it in your head. All right, so the tricky part though is what I call stateful non-visual logic. So what do I mean by that? Let's kind of break it down. So we've got the players and teams component again, right? On the left and on the right. But this time they are rendering different components. So on the left, you have that same slideshow component. But on the right now, we have an image list component, which, just is a long list of images. It still paginates, but a different component. So the thing is, though, this players component and our teams component, they still want to call the same fetch images API, right? They still need to maintain the state of which page you're on and the images to display to pass to the components. And they just need to be able to support clicking to the next page and things like that. So they have similar state and they have similar logic, but they have different UI. So how do we share that state and that logic? Not the UI, but the state and logic. So ideally, we want to be able to render a paginated players images or team logos as a slideshow like we have here, a list view. But what about a grid view or anything else, right? We would want to be able to hook it up into any sort of UI. And we don't want to have to repeat that state and that logic. So what I want to do is I want to take us on a journey the rest of this time of how we've tried to solve this problem of stateful, non-visual logic in React over its lifetime. And hopefully, if we do this right, you will also understand React a bit better. However, before we keep going, can I get everybody to stand up? I want you to stand up. I know I can't see you at the current moment. You can't see me, but we're going to stand up, right? And we're going to do 10 air squats together. It's the end of the day right now. You probably were at work, at school, or whatever the case may be. So we're going to stand up and just do 10 squats together. I'm going to count them out. Hopefully, I'm not the only one doing this right now. Otherwise, it's quite awkward. And if you're watching this on the YouTube video link later, I want you to still stand up no matter where you are. Okay, here we go. I'm going to count it out for us. Ready? 1. I'm really doing them, so hope you are too. 2. Keep going. 3. 4. Bend at the hips. 5. 6. We're almost there. 7. 8. 9 and 10. Awesome job. Okay, hopefully you actually did it. Let me know in the chat if you did it. Also let me know in the chat if you just sat there and thought I was silly. Either way, that's fine, but now let's continue on. Okay, so just to formally introduce myself, my name is Ben Ilegbodu. I'm a Christian, a husband, and a father. Here's my family right here. That's my wife, Rashida. We just celebrated our 12th year anniversary. And it's our 3 kids. My oldest daughter, she's 8. Her name is Simone. Middle daughter just celebrated her 6th birthday. And our youngest son is 3.5 years old. I'm actually originally from Houston. That's why I had the Houston Rockets hat on. But I moved to the Bay Area, now currently living in a town called Pittsburgh without an H on the end. And we've been here, and I've been here in the Bay Area for 20 years now. Uh, Amazing. But spoiler alert or news flash, we're actually moving back to Houston. I was just talking to Fabian about that, being here for 20 years, and now get to announce that we're moving back. So end of December, family's finally moving back. The Houstonian finally gets to be back in his hometown. So I'm excited about that. And maybe in the future, if we meet in person, I'll actually be able to meet you all in person. So let's continue on. I'm seeing that some people, were sitting down and just listening to me count to 10, but that's okay. I am also a Google developer expert and currently a front-end architect at Stitch Fix. If you're not familiar with Stitch Fix, I'm sure you're familiar with Google, but if you're not familiar with Stitch Fix, it's an online personal styling service. It combines technology and data science with an actual human stylist who will style your stuff for you. So we try to take the effort out of shopping by providing a selection of clothes that are just picked for you, and we'll send it directly to you at your house on whatever frequency you want. Every month, every 2 weeks, every week, if you're really a shopaholic, all that's fine. And we're hiring. Our headquarters is in San Francisco, but we have remote engineers throughout the country. It's great. I actually mentioned our job openings at the last conference I spoke with. Someone reached out to me, and now we're coworkers because I connected her to the right people. So I guess I've got connections. So here we go. I am also a huge basketball fan, Rockets fan, like I said. Love playing basketball, love watching the NBA. And like I said, because I grew up in Houston, I'm still a fan. I know we're not winning a lot, but I'm a true fan. So I'm still watching the games, got NBA League Pass because I couldn't be at the games. But I'm excited for our future. And I mentioned the Rockets and basketball because all my code examples revolve around basketball. So that's just a heads up. That's why we're talking about players. That's why we're talking about teams. All right. So enough about me. Let's finally jump right in and let's talk about this history, right? So like I said, we're going from now, the present, to the past. So I want to talk with what we're probably most familiar with if we develop in React, and that's custom hooks. So custom hooks were specifically designed actually to solve this problem of sharing stateful, non-visual logic. They came out with, or hooks in general came out with React 16.8. So that's like early 2019. And if you've developed in React recently, you should be using hooks. So let's take a look at them. All right. So here's our players component again, the actual implementation of it. And remember, we need a way to retrieve those images, right? So, well, now we get to use this special function. It's called use images. It's actually a hook. And in this case, it's a custom hook because we've defined it ourselves. And we'll take a little peek at how it's implemented in a second. But our players component calls this use images custom hook, passing it the optional team ID. So then use images returns 3 things. The images, which is the list of images to display in the UI, such as our slideshow here. Cur page, which is the current page in our paginated list of things, whatever the things may be in the UI. And then plus this set cur page, which is a function that a UI can use to say the page is changing to whatever the new page is. So this players component passes all of those three properties to the slideshow component in this UI. And, it seems pretty magical, to be honest. And in a sense it is, but it'll kind of make sense. We're getting these data back, and you'll see when we look at the implementation of use images. And then finally, the use image is custom hook. It looks like a normal function call because, it has the typical inputs, team ID, and it returns stuff to us. And it's completely separate from the render, which is pretty cool. So let's take a look at how it works. All right. So custom hooks are functions, normal functions, and they must start with use. So we're calling ours use images because it's going to give us images and other information about images. So it maintains state for the images and the curve page variable using this built-in use state hook. And it fetches the new images whenever the current page changes. That's what the array syntax is near the bottom of it. And we're using the built-in use effect hook, which kind of takes some getting used to be honest, but it works out pretty well. So we have our images, we have our current page state, and then finally, we return this data to the consuming component, whichever one ends up calling our use images. So in our example, that was players. And we also pass back this set curve page function, which will update the current page there. So it's pretty nice that this entire functionality for this encapsulation of stateful non-visual logic can fit on this one slide here. Like this is the entirety of the code, which is pretty nice. And we'll see in a bit how gnarly these things can get as we look at some of the kind of earlier the predecessors to hooks. So one, if you remember that we also have that teams component, right? Here it is, that we wanted to pass or use a different component. So instead of using a slideshow, we want to render an image list. Well, now we can use the same type of data that we get back from use images, but pass it to a different component because it takes the same sort of data. So we'll call use image, the use images custom hook, just like before, just like with the players component. But this time we'll pass the data to the image list here. So the same images, curve page, and set curve page. So image list has a different handler. It's called on page, which it'll call when the page changes. And we pass it that same set curve page function that will then update the state and cause a re-render. So we're able to share the same state management and API calls, like all that stuff that we don't really want to duplicate and just focus on the UI changing. So this is across two different components that render two completely different UIs, slideshow, and image list. And that's the power and the ease of custom hooks. Like it takes a while to figure out how to write a custom hook, but once you have it down, that abstraction is pretty powerful and pretty cool. And the nice thing about custom hooks is that over the patterns we're about to see is that we can call them in sequence. So it looks like things are sequential, but we can do all sorts of pretty cool things and pass data between the hooks. So with all that said, there's still issues. So one thing is React hooks cannot be called conditionally. So let's say I have a prop in this case, and it's like display translations in our example. So if it's false, I know I shouldn't have to get the translations or call use i18 in, but you can't conditionally call hooks. That's just how they implemented it. But there are workarounds for this, and I'll share a blog post that I wrote about it at the end. So if you've ever wanted to or wondered how you could, stay tuned. I'll share a link on my blog, or I guess you could go to my blog right now and search. But you need to be paying attention to me, so don't do that yet. The other thing is that custom hooks don't render any markup, right? For the most part, they deal purely in data, and sometimes you may need that, want that. So that's an FYI. And this is also why custom hooks haven't killed another pattern, quote unquote, killed, which is render props. That came before custom hooks. And what are render props? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's talk about those next. So technically, render props have always existed in React. And they still do now, actually, even after custom hooks. But they were popularized by Michael Jackson from Remix. If you've ever heard of him, he was doing a whole spiel about how we should be using render props. And they were supposed to be a superior replacement for HOCs, which we'll actually talk about next. And this was right around when React 16 was released, so like mid 2017 or so. I'm actually curious if people were developing in React at that point. So like 2017, 18, 19, that was it. Let me know in the chat. But let's see how render props compare to hooks. All right. So avert your eyes, or don't hurt your eyes. This is a lot of code to look at, and it isn't even all of the code. I had to like abstract some of it because it wouldn't all fit, but I'm still going to break it down for you. So instead of a special function for our shareable code, we have a shareable class component. Is anyone still actually using class components right now instead of hooks or in function components? I'm actually kind of curious. Let me know about that. But here we're calling our component images. So this compares to our use images hook. This is going to be an images component that we'll see how it's used in a second. So it has the same state as our hook, but it's defined in the class component way. So this is how one of the ways you can define the state. And remember, right, images will be the list of images to display in the UI, and current page will be the current page that's in the paginated list of the UI. So next we have component did mount and component did update life cycles. I am so glad I don't have to worry about these life cycles anymore with hooks, but what they did, if you're still using class components, I guess it's still do, present tense. But what they did is this one is retrieving the images that initially, or retrieves the images initially when either the current page state, or team ID prop change. And then they call update images this helper function. And we'll see how the team ID prop is used in a couple of slides, actually. So update images. Now this helper is where we actually fetch the images, where we call fetch images. And then you can hopefully see at the end, that's where we set the images state with the return data. And here, update images is intended to be private, but we didn't have private methods back then. They now exist on class components, which is nice, with the little # hashtag symbol, but we didn't have those back then. So sometimes we used underscores to prefix them, but not all the time. So component did mount, component did update, and update images are effectively equivalent to our use effect before. Like all that use effect code is this. That was like, I don't know, 6 lines of code, and this is like, I don't want to count. lines of code. So if class components are not familiar to you, don't get too hung up on this code either way. I'm not trying to teach you class components. I just wanted you to try to understand how the class components worked. And lastly, we have the render that I couldn't even fit on the screen. So let's take a look at what the render method looked like. Oh, I'm seeing someone that says that they still use class components at their team and functions. Well, sadly, you should be a little bit ashamed. But whatever gets the job done is most important. But I would argue that class components make it harder to get the job done. Anyway, let's keep going. This is the render method of our render prop component. So here's where the magic happens. The key piece is the render prop pattern, which is a function called render. So it's a special component prop that is a function. It's not a piece of data or anything like that. So typically, function props were like callback functions like on click or on change. They were kind of related to some user event, such as a click. And they did something, but they usually, function props hardly ever return something. But this render prop here is a function that passes data and will return JSX. So it actually renders something out. And technically, it could be named anything, but render is a common convention, hence the term render prop. It is also common to use children as a prop too, as we'll see in an example in a bit. So within this render method, we call the render prop, and we pass it the data that the caller, the component that's using images, will need. So first, we pass the images and curve page state properties that we've been maintaining. That's the stateful part of it. And then we pass next pages. Hopefully you all can hear me. Okay. Then we pass this handle next page callback. So this handle page next page callback is similar to the handler from before, the set curve page. It's basically for updating the curve page state whenever we're paginating. So updating the current page will ultimately fetch new images, that state, which will in turn call the render prop with the new images state. So the question now is, how do we use this render prop? I've talked all the way through it, but how do we use it? Well, it looks kind of like a normal React component, actually. So that images render prop component we just defined basically exposes its internal state to the parent component, which in this case is players. So you'll see by passing the render prop function, players can now get access and render whatever data it would like. So it's just based upon whatever is in that data prop that's passed in the render function. So it receives all that data and then is able to render out this slideshow component, just like in the previous examples there. So any other UI that would depend on data that we want to render would also need to go inside of this render prop function, inside of images especially. So render props are great. I still use render props currently. I use functions, not class components, but they're pretty great. But especially back then, when we used them, one of the problems was React prop types only has prop types.func. So whenever you're trying to have runtime checking of the prop types, you use prop types.func. And if you've used it before, you know that it's limited, right? For prop types.func. There's no way to define what parameters the function will take. And you can't define what the return value will be either. So let's take a look at this example on the left, right? What shape is the translation object going to be? And when that's passed back to the I18N component, like what properties are in the auth data object, and the render prop for auth? Like, is the theme object a single value, or is it a combination value? You just have no idea looking at the code. It can be tricky to figure this stuff out without something like TypeScript, for instance, which I highly, highly recommend if you're using React. There's definitely a learning curve to picking up TypeScript, but once you started using TypeScript, writing in JavaScript just feels totally unsafe, I should say. So also after that, as we can see here, when there are multiple render props, things can get pretty crazy with the nesting. With the render props, the entire UI basically is nested within that function prop. So here we have just 3 render props, which is not too unheard of. And we're 6 levels indented before we even get to any real UI, which is not callback hell, it's render prop hell in a sense. So, but overall, like I said, render props worked really well for this kind of stateful non-visual logic, but hooks kind of took over as a tailor-made solution. However, render props are still useful today when a component wants to, 1, share stateful non-visual logic, like we just talked about, and also needs to offload some rendering of the UI to the parent. So it's not just returning data, but actually needs the parent to do some rendering. So I wish I could go into more talking about all those use cases, but it would be a tangent from our topic, I guess. Plus, I have 2 more topics to cover. So let's go ahead and let's talk about the pattern that was popular before render props. Okay, and apparently Houston React developers is Team HOC. So let's talk about higher order components. So you may never have seen HOCs depending on when you started working in React. Just like with render props, HOCs technically always existed. But the pattern was quote unquote first created or first popularized or first created way back with React 0.13. So we're talking early 2015. All right, early in React's existence. So it really became popular with when Dan Abramoff, before he even started with Facebook, he kind of started pitching the idea of HOCs and started writing blogs about it. But it became heavily used because of Redux. So the React Redux library, it had this connect function, which connected Redux to React, and it itself was an HOC. So that's when the pattern became popular. So render props can do everything that a HOC can do, and arguably in a better way and a better developer experience. So render props essentially replaced HOCs. It made the HOC pattern obsolete. People still write HOCs now, but there really isn't a use case for them from my perspective. And that's why Michael Jackson was saying that render props should replace them. But you know what? Let's take a look at them anyway, because maybe you may see some HOCs in the wild, especially if you're looking at legacy code. And yeah, they were the way before render props to solve the problem of sharing stateful non-visual logic. And this is especially true because Mixins were banned and all we had was HOCs. But that's a spoiler alert. I'll talk about Mixins after this. Okay. So, let's do something different. Let's look at how the HOC was used before we actually look at how it was written. Okay, because HOCs are used very differently than render props. So I kind of want to work through how that is. So first, hopefully my connection is okay. Getting alerts sometimes that my internet is not okay. But let's see. So our HOC is called with images here. It actually looks pretty similar to our use images hook, except that the way that we use with images is completely outside of the component definition. We pass a reference to our players component to with images. So instead of passing data or anything, we're actually passing an entire component to it. And it gives us back this kind of enhanced or wrapped version of the component. It's called a higher order, technically. And here's what here's where things get interesting, let's just say. So even though the player's component won't be past the images or the cur page prop from the app isn't passing it into the player's component. It's now like magically there in the props, and it has it available to pass to the slideshow. So by wrapping the player's component with images, the HOC provides those props for the player's component or anything that gets wrapped by it. So it just needs to render those props appropriately, I guess. So similarly, as the slideshow paginates on next, we call that similar handle next page prop. This is also a prop that the player's component gets magically by being wrapped by with images. And then lastly, we export the enhanced player's component. It's actually the component that will be used in the app, not our player's component, but the enhanced version. So in my opinion, this is all a bit weird. It's kind of difficult to wrap your head around a function, wrapping another component. So it's weird at first, it's weird at second, it's weird at third and fourth probably. But eventually you pick it up. But I still found HOCs to be a strange concept. But anyway, let's look at it behind the curtain and see how the magic is happening, shall we? So an HOC was, and I guess technically is, if you really wanted to write it in modern React, was a function that takes an existing component. So here we're passing in the component and returns another component that wraps the original component. Hopefully that made sense. So with images, our with images is our HOC. And it takes that component parameter, that reference as a parameter. So remember, we're passing the players component in our example. So think of component as players. So prefixing the HOC with WITH, was a common convention. It wasn't a requirement like use is with hooks, but it was convention. Although React Redux broke that convention by just calling it connect. Anyway, our hook was named use images. Our render prop was called images, a component. So naturally, our HOC is called with images. And it returns a new class component called images. It's a component class that wraps the actual component, remember, that we passed in as a parameter. So images has all the same state and lifecycle methods as the render prop. So you can see the state here. I put comments for the lifecycle methods and update images because there'll be way too much code. The big difference here, though, is that the HOC renders the component that's passed in. So we get that component reference, and now we use JSX to render it out. So that class component, we're now rendering it out. and it passes along all the props that were passed to the component. And then it adds in additional props from the state that it's maintaining. So that curve page state that gets updated as we paginate that UI, remember that's our state. And then the images state that comes back from fetching the new images based on that current page. And then lastly, we have this handle next page callback function prop, which updates the curve page state. So it's all basically the same thing, just mixed up in a different package. More confusing, I would add, or I would suggest. There's a lot more to the HOC code. I'm just showing to show you the highlights. And again, the HOC function is a function that takes a component class and returns a wrapped one. And if you totally don't understand any of this, that's totally fine too. Like, it's a bit confusing even when you have time to sit down and break it down. But just wanted to show you what an HOC looked like in the wild. But HOCs, they worked okay. Really, they served a good purpose for a year or so, maybe 2 years. But there were several gotchas with them. So first is HOCs inherently relied on indirection and handshake agreements to work. So with HOCs, the only communication is through the props. But if you had multiple HOCs, looking at the component implementation, we wouldn't know which HOC provided which props, right? So is this value prop coming from the with I18N, or is it coming with theme? So if you're looking at a specific code, you wouldn't even know which HOC provided it. So imagine jumping into a component, it's using a bunch of HOCs. You have no idea which one is providing which. It's harder to debug. And then there can be prop name collisions. So imagine if two HOCs try to set the same prop, right? You know, value is a common name for a prop. Name is a common name for a prop. Multiple HOCs trying to set that same prop would cause problems because you can't. Only one could. And if there were HOCs maybe from different packages or even different parts of the code base that didn't know about each other, we'd have problems. Lastly, there's no way to alter or configure how the HOCs are composed based upon the component's prop or state. So let's use this code snippet on the left, right? So maybe we only want to add with auth, that HOC, if a needs auth prop was set to true. But the problem is that the composition of the HOCs, maybe you're using that compose helper that we're talking about in the chat. The composition of the HOCs is happening outside of the render. You can see it's like underneath the example class. So there's no way that the prop values can impact which HOCs are used. This wasn't always a problem, but it did make complex solutions very difficult. But again, like I said, don't worry if you don't understand them. I'd actually be surprised if this was the first time seeing an HOC and you actually got it. So HOCs, higher order components, were based upon higher order functions. That's where they came from, higher order functions in math. So many blog posts are written about them to try to explain the concept, but you'll never need to write one. Should never need to write one, thanks to hooks and render props. Okay, so we've talked about hooks, right? We talked about render props, and just now we finished HOCs, which hopefully you'll never have to deal with. Let's bring it home and let's talk about the OG way of handling this problem of stateful non-visual logic, and that is Mixins. So this is React 0.14 and before. So we're talking early 2016 and before. After this, you couldn't use mixins. So it was actually the original way of sharing stateful non-visual logic, and mixins were created like hooks. Mixins were created for this purpose. So I'm assuming most of you, if not all of you, have never seen mixin code, never had to deal with it, because I'm talking 2015 and earlier. But if somebody in the chat has used mixins before, let me know. I never really developed in mixins. I just saw some code that was using it as we were transitioning over to class components. But I can't say that I was totally a mixologist. Let's say mixologist. Okay, so let's take a look at this mixin code. So we have this images mixin. One thing to note is that it's just a simple object. It's not a function. It's not a class. It's just an object. And interestingly enough, though, it has the same images and curve page state as before. It's just a get initial state function on the object, which is similar, to a class constructor. Then we have the component did mount and component did update lifecycle methods as well. I didn't even bother writing those out again because they're the same as before with the render prop and HOC, and I needed space on the slide. They retrieve the images initially, and again, whenever the curve page value changes or the team ID prop changes. And then we have the lifecycle methods. The lifecycle methods call update images. And just as a friendly reminder, this is where we make the actual fetch images call. Remember the helper utility that we defined in the beginning. And that sets the images state that's above with the return data from the fetch call. So all the innards are the same as before. And the update images function is supposed to be private again with this mixin, but we'll see shortly how anything outside of the mixin technically could be called. And then lastly, we provide this handle next page helper method, the same one that we've been talking about before. But the interesting thing enough is it's exclusively for the components to update the current page. Like it's written in the mixin, like it's going to be used inside the mixin, but it's actually defined so that the components that use the mixin can call it. And we'll see that in a bit. So at a high level, though, it looks simple enough, right? I've definitely used it a little bit and hidden lots of code. I've hidden lots of code in this example so that it can fit on the slide, like I said. But like hooks, mixins were for this problem. So let's take a look at how we would use the mixin. So first, we use react.create class. I don't know if anybody's ever used react.create class, but it was the OG way before ES6 classes to create a class component. And that's how we're creating our players component here. So it create class took an optional mixins property. So here we're passing in our images mixin object that we just defined. And remember, the images mixin defines the images and curve page state variables. So it doesn't really so much pass it to the players like it did with the render prop or the hook or even the HOC. What it does is that it just defines them and then they magically show up so that now we have the state available to pass into the slideshow. So it's really just like, because the mixin got mixed into the component, it now has the state available. And then finally, the handle next page method, remember that we defined as well, is just magically available for us to call and use or pass to something else. So here we're passing it to on next there. So, there's some magic happening, just like with HOCs. So it's pretty similar to them. Uh, the thing is like we have to know somehow that images and cur page and even handle next page are just available for us to use, which is kind of like a handshake deal there. So Mixins had some challenges, to say the least, right? So one, Mixins weren't available in ES6 classes or ES classes. So when React decided to move towards ES6 classes, it was a big deal because all of a sudden mixins weren't allowed, which is also why HOCs became a thing that people used because they needed some other alternative to HOC, to mixins. So the whole reason why React moved to the ES6 classes is that they didn't want to have to maintain a whole class system, create class and what have you. Also, mixins had the same indirection problem as HOCs and maybe even more. So a mixin might need the component to define a helper method or property or vice versa. So in this case, we provided that handle next page method, right, in images mixin, and then the players component relied on its existence and passed it as a call. Some mixins were the reverse. They expected the component to define a method or a property, and then it would use it and call it or what have you. And then furthermore, if there are multiple mixins, it'd be hard to know what provided the state. Just like we saw with HOCs, it's like, is it the I18N mixin that's providing this state, or is it the auth mixin? I don't know. I have to go and figure that out. And there could also be naming collisions. Two mixins wanted to define a method or a state, they would collide. So these problems were so bad that eventually the React team provided this blog post called "Mixins Are Considered Harmful." It's actually on their official blog, and I got a link to that in the slides. So let's do a quick comparison before we wrap up. This is what a mixin looks like. This is the full implementation with everything. This is 2015. And then now contrast that with the use images hook implementation, which is the new way in 2019, 2022. It's the same way. So there's been a lot of churn in the React ecosystem in those 4 years between this and this. For those of us who are actually developing React, but I'll certainly take hooks over mixins any day and twice on Fridays. But it makes me wonder, what will React look like 4 years from now? Like, will components just write themselves or whatever? Who knows? So as we wrap here, there are several blog posts here that you can read that cover the history of React. It's funny how their official blog posts on their React blog that provide a timeline of the approved method of solving this problem of stateful non-visual logic. But React continues to evolve, which is nice. Okay, so that's it. Hopefully you found this reverse journey insightful, and hopefully it made you appreciate hooks a bit more. And hopefully you got a history lesson out of it too. So again, these slides are already available online. We already posted a link to them in the chat. Totally check those out. Follow along, copy examples, hopefully of just the hooks. Follow those links to resources. Got some, if you got questions, feel free to ask them in the Q&A that we're about to start in a second. I'll be doing my best to answer them. And if you got questions about React in general, and not specifically about hooks or mixins or HOCs, I'll totally answer those too. But if after we're done now live, you got other questions, right? Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter at BenNVP. I'll totally try to answer those then as well. That's totally cool. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. That was awesome. I'm actually going to leave my screen off just because of connectivity issues. But with
No
that,
worries.
yes, yeah. With that, anybody who has a question, now is the time. We're at the end. We want to throw those questions his way so that you get the opportunity to ask that question, and then Ben can answer that for you. Fabian, I know you always have questions.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Oh no, I don't know if can y'all see me? I don't know if my screen's froze.
I only see me.
Yeah, we lost you there.
Okay.
Oh, there you are.
There we go.
Perfect.
You're back.
I'm sorry, Tracy. I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, I'm just saying, I know that you normally have questions, and that gives the viewers times to kind of write in their questions while you are asking, and then we will check the chat after that.
Gotcha. Yeah, awesome talk, Ben. I really appreciate. I think, especially with JavaScript, it's always good to have a history lesson, because from what I've seen, and if you're new to JavaScript, you will soon learn that history tends to repeat itself. And I've seen new tools come out, like, check this out, latest and greatest, and it's like, that's already been done before, and there's a reason why we moved away from it, right?
Yeah.
And so then it's like, I very much enjoy history lessons, and this being one of them. I kind of see a side-by-side comparison between hooks to render props to HOCs, which I actually thought was the opposite. I thought render props came before HOCs, so I learned that today, and I never got to experience Mixins, so it was good to kind of see how it worked.
You're lucky.
So
you did it.
Yeah, we don't at work, we don't use HOCs anymore. We definitely have moved over to hooks, but it's kind of like, I left a few comments on the ways that we've used HOCs and like namespace and some of those things to get around some of the pain points it gave us. But so one question that I did have while we wait, so I know we already have a question coming in, is with React, it's constantly evolving, and now with with frameworks such as Next.js, Remix, which is something that you've kind of seen, like this pendulum swing where we had started with Angular and Ember, and it's like, no, we need to go to component libraries, just libraries, and now it's going back to frameworks. But this time, obviously, it's we're introducing the server now to our tool set. So I just wanted to ask you your thoughts. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to hold you to it, but I see that kind of being like the next evolution in front end development, where we kind of bring in we've learned from our pain points in React, where it's like like a static site server side rendering, like being able to like SEOs, stuff like that, that component library. And so I just wanted to get your thoughts on on that front, and how have you seen? I've actually haven't used any of these frameworks. I don't know if you've had experience, but how hooks play into those. Has anything changed as like, does the mindset of a developer need to, I guess, evolve with these tools? So yeah.
So I use Next.js. Enjoy working with it, and it's the nice thing about Next is that you can build an app that's more similar to Create React app. It's all on the client. You can create something that's like Gatsby, which is all static site generated. You can create something that's just completely SSR server generated, or some hybrid of it, which is pretty cool. And I assume Remix is similar to that. I haven't used Remix, but the cool thing now with React is that we have an opportunity to own the whole stack, like be full stack developers, but all within React using Node. So the actual implementation of how you write code, at least with Next.js, doesn't really change so much, which is a nice part. So you still have your hooks, you still call them, you still call your APIs is just kind of slightly different when you call them for the server, when you call them from the client. So I think what the new frameworks have learned is that there's not an appetite to write things completely differently depending on if you're doing server and doing client. So they're able to like mesh that together so that there's a better developer experience.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm just now dipping my toes into them, like, and not there are slight changes, a slight, but it's where do I fetch this data? Does this data
Yeah.
need to be prefetched? And it's
Yep.
like there is definitely like a little bit of I guess life cycle, like life cycle methods or life cycle event, tweaks that I need to make to our applications. The other question, dang it, just slipped my mind. Because I'm seeing the use query. So let me check out the comp. So right now I'm looking at the thread or the chat. Just make sure before I ask another question. Maybe you could use HOCs to protect the routes as long as you don't nest too many. It seems like a rule of thumb. By the way, are you still there, Ben? Make sure I didn't lose you.
Oh, sorry.
There you go. No, you're fine.
Yep.
You're fine. If okay, yeah. And so this is kind of like Oscar's question or comment kind of spurs this next question, which is around unnecessary re-renders. I don't know if it's just me or maybe because I'm more experienced, I'm just more aware of them. Where one thing that has bit us in the past, a learning experience, where like when context was introduced, and that in addition with wrappers, where it's like unnecessary re-renders, like ridiculous, like it did bad performance. And so I just like looking at render props from what I've learned about, especially when like use memo came out or use callback and the reason why you need to use it so that way you don't unnecessarily re-render. It's like I look at those render props and it's like, well, it looks like you're passing a function into a prop, which I guess would cause a re-render every time. So I don't know if that wasn't the case, or if it was in fact the case, and maybe just as a community we didn't know that this was happening. But I don't know. Like, am I mistaken on that part?
Yeah, that's totally it. Because the re-renders happen when a prop changes, and if you define an anonymous function, it's going to change every time the component re-renders. So in a sense, the render prop does. The question is does the re-render impact their performance? Like, yes, it may re-render, but at the end of the day, if the virtual DOM diffs properly and nothing in the UI changes, then it should be okay. Depends on the app, of course. Like the slowest part is updating the DOM and having shift in the UI. So I think there's been at some point, I don't hear it as much, but this huge push on, oh, we got to stop re-renders, we got to be militant about it and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, the question is really the performance of the app. And if you try to pre-optimize performance, you end up making code that's gnarly and using use memo everywhere, and it's super confusing and stuff like that. Like I've seen that type of code as well. So it's really important to first test it. And then, yes, if that's a problem, then kind of look into other opportunities to use callback and cache the function and stuff like that so that it's not inline and things like that. So I think in the beginning of render props, yes, we were not aware or we didn't care as much because of the developer experience it provided. But the real question is, does it have a negative impact or not?
Yeah. You heard it here first. Ben said, don't do use callback. It's not worth it. I'm just kidding, man.
Yeah, just only use it when you need it. So if you're going to use it, test that it's a problem first.
Yeah, that's good advice for sure. So yeah, I mean, it looks like we didn't strike much luck as far as the question, but definitely comments. I mean, this to me, the HOCs, especially HOCs, render props, maybe not so much hooks yet, but I know from my experience talking with developers, you either get it or you don't get it,
Yep.
and eventually you will get it. It will eventually click, but you know
Yep.
the pain points are, I don't want to say growing pains, but just learning about it. I guess maybe developers won't need to learn about it now. But yeah, I mean, if no questions come in, I mean, Tracy, are you still there? We can go ahead and I guess wrap up, and we can just do any kind of closing announcements.
Yes, thank you again, Ben, for presenting. That was awesome. It was very entertaining as well. Some of your comments were making me laugh while I was on mute. But anytime in the future, you're more than welcome to present again. Any type of topic related to React, we would love it. Thank you. I'm sorry.
I said, of course. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. To the viewers, like it was mentioned, that's it for us for 2022. We will be back for 2023, so hang in there. And then, like I mentioned before, please go to our YouTube channel. We have a library of all the other meetups. Feel free to watch through those, any of them that you possibly missed as well. And we will see you guys again in the next year.
Absolutely. Awesome. Thank you so much, Ben. It was a really good presentation. This to me is like icing on the cake to wrap up our 2022.
Awesome.
Yeah,
awesome.
For sure.
You enjoyed it. Take care.
All right. Bye, y'all.
All right.